Everyone thinks perfectionism is about high standards, about striving for excellence. Carl Jung saw something far more unsettling. He believed perfectionism wasn't proof of dedication. It was fear in disguise. Not fear of failure, fear of the terrifying power hidden inside you if you stopped perfecting and finally began. What if the real reason you obsess over every detail, every word, every plan isn't because you want things perfect, but because perfection keeps you safe? Safe from responsibility, safe from visibility, safe from the truth that you might be capable of far more than you've ever allowed yourself to believe. Jung discovered that perfectionism often masks a deeper terror, the fear of becoming extraordinary. Because if you stopped polishing, stopped preparing, and actually acted on your potential, you would have to face the life, the power, and the self you've been avoiding all along. Today, we'll explore Jung's most provocative insight about perfectionism, why the endless chase for just right keeps you small, and how to break free without losing your ambition. The Perfectionist's Shadow of Greatness. In Carl Gustav Jung's analytical psychology, perfectionism reveals itself as one of the most sophisticated forms of what he called shadow work avoidance. But unlike the typical understanding of shadow as our repressed darkness, the perfectionist's shadow often contains their repressed light, their capacity for brilliance, influence, and extraordinary achievement that has been deemed too dangerous to fully embrace. Jung observed that the psyche maintains equilibrium through what he termed psychological homeostasis. When an individual begins to approach their true potential, the ego often experiences this as a threat to its established identity and safety. Perfectionism emerges as the perfect defense mechanism. It appears to be moving toward excellence, while actually preventing the individual from ever reaching it. The perfectionist's relationship with their own greatness is fundamentally conflicted. On one level, they are drawn to it, hence their high standards and ambitious visions. But on a deeper, often unconscious level, they are terrified of what owning their greatness would require of them. Greatness demands visibility, responsibility, and the courage to stand apart from the crowd. It requires accepting that one has been playing small and could have been making a significant impact all along. Consider the perfectionist writer who has been working on their novel for 7 years. They claim to be perfecting their craft, but Jung would see something more complex. They are caught between their calling to create something meaningful and their terror of the responsibility that would come with creating something truly powerful. What if the book changes lives? What if it doesn't? Both possibilities are equally frightening because both force the individual to confront the magnitude of their creative capacity. Jung understood that perfectionism creates what he called transcendent avoidance, the systematic avoidance of our own transcendent potential. The perfectionist sets standards so high that they become impossible to meet, ensuring that they never have to face the moment of actually releasing their greatness into the world. They can spend lifetimes preparing to be great without ever having to be great. This dynamic is particularly insidious because it masquerades as virtue. Society rewards perfectionist tendencies, seeing them as evidence of dedication and high standards. The perfectionist receives admiration for their commitment to excellence, while secretly using that commitment as a fortress against their own potential. They become addicted to the preparation phase because it feels safer than the performance phase. Jung also recognized that perfectionism often emerges in individuals who possess what he called numinous potential, gifts that transcend the ordinary and touch something sacred or transformative. These individuals unconsciously recognize that their abilities carry weight and consequence, and perfectionism becomes their way of managing the anxiety this recognition creates. The shadow of greatness reveals itself in the perfectionist's chronic dissatisfaction. Nothing is ever quite good enough because the unconscious knows that the individual is capable of so much more than they are allowing themselves to express. This creates a constant state of internal tension. the self calling toward full expression, while the ego maintains elaborate barriers to prevent that expression. There is also the phenomenon Jung observed of compensatory grandiosity. Because the perfectionist cannot allow themselves to be ordinarily great, they unconsciously demand that they be extraordinarily great. Since extraordinary greatness feels impossible to achieve, they remain stuck in endless preparation, avoiding the merely excellent work that could actually impact the world. The perfectionist's shadow contains not only their repressed greatness, but also their repressed ordinariness, their capacity to create imperfect work that still carries value and meaning. They have banished their human ability to contribute meaningfully without being flawless, creating an impossible standard that serves primarily to prevent action. Jung believed that this shadow of greatness accumulates power over time. The longer an individual avoids expressing their gifts, the more powerful and frightening those gifts become in the unconscious. What might have been naturally expressed in youth becomes a towering, intimidating potential in midlife, making action feel even more overwhelming. But what exactly makes greatness feel so threatening? What is it about our own potential that creates such profound psychological resistance? The terror of transcendence. To understand why perfectionism serves as such an effective barrier to greatness, we must explore what Jung saw as one of the deepest fears in the human psyche: the terror of transcendence. This is not the fear of failure, but something far more primal, the fear of succeeding so completely that our entire understanding of ourselves and our place in the world must be reconstructed. Jung observed that transcendence, the movement beyond our current limitations into fuller expression of our potential, is simultaneously the deepest longing and the greatest fear of the human soul. We yearn to become all that we are capable of becoming, yet we are terrified of the psychological death that such becoming requires. For to transcend our current self is to kill our current self, and the ego experiences this as literal death. The terror of transcendence manifests first as the fear of our own power. When we glimpse what we are truly capable of, the lives we could touch, the changes we could create, the impact we could have, the responsibility feels overwhelming. Power, even positive power, carries weight. It demands that we show up consistently, that we use our gifts wisely, that we accept the consequences of our influence. Many people unconsciously prefer powerlessness because it comes with fewer demands. Consider someone who recognizes they have extraordinary leadership abilities. Owning this gift means accepting responsibility not just for their own life, but potentially for the lives of those they lead. It means accepting that their decisions carry weight, that people will look to them for direction, that their example will influence others. Perfectionism becomes a way of avoiding this responsibility. I'm not ready to lead yet. I need to develop myself more first. There is also the terror of isolation that often accompanies greatness. Jung understood that individuals who fully embrace their potential often find themselves standing apart from their peers. Excellence can be lonely, and the perfectionist unconsciously recognizes this. By remaining in preparation mode, they can maintain connection with others who are also working on their dreams without having to face the potential isolation of actually achieving them. The fear of transcendence includes what Jung called ontological anxiety, the fear of discovering that our essential nature is far grander than we believed. If we are capable of creating meaningful work, influencing others positively, or contributing something significant to the world, then what does this say about who we have been up until now? The revelation of our greatness forces us to confront all the ways we have been living beneath our potential. Jung also identified the terror of numinous responsibility. Some gifts carry what he saw as sacred weight, the ability to heal, to inspire, to create beauty that touches the transcendent. Individuals who possess such gifts often unconsciously recognize their numinous quality and feel unworthy or unprepared to channel something so significant. Perfectionism becomes their way of preparing for this sacred responsibility. often indefinitely. There is the related fear of what Jung called archetypal possession. When we fully embrace our greatness, we may find ourselves expressing archetypal energies: the creator, the healer, the visionary, the leader. These archetypes carry tremendous power, but they also demand that we become vessels for something larger than our personal ego. The perfectionist fears losing control of their carefully constructed identity to these greater forces. The terror of transcendence also includes the fear of success itself. Jung observed that many people are more frightened of succeeding wildly than of failing completely. Failure allows us to maintain our familiar identity and blame external circumstances. Success, particularly extraordinary success, forces us to acknowledge our own agency and capability, making future mediocrity inexcusable. Perhaps most fundamentally, there is the fear of what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming uniquely ourselves. Perfectionism can be an attempt to achieve greatness through conformity to external standards rather than through authentic self-expression. It feels safer to pursue someone else's definition of perfection than to discover and express our own unique form of excellence. The perfectionist unconsciously recognizes that true greatness requires authenticity, vulnerability, and the courage to be imperfect in service of something greater. This feels infinitely more dangerous than the controlled imperfection of endless revision and preparation. But how does this terror of transcendence manifest in the daily life of the perfectionist? What are the concrete ways this fear expresses itself and limits potential? The prison of impossible standards. The perfectionist's terror of transcendence manifests most clearly in what Jung would recognize as a sophisticated form of self-imprisonment. The creation of impossible standards that ensure greatness remains forever out of reach. This is not merely about setting high goals, but about unconsciously designing criteria for success that can never be met, providing the perfect justification for remaining in perpetual preparation. Jung understood that the psyche is remarkably clever in its self-protective mechanisms. The perfectionist does not consciously choose to avoid greatness. Instead, they create elaborate systems of standards, requirements, and conditions that must be met before they can begin to express their true potential. These systems appear rational and admirable on the surface, but serve the unconscious function of preventing the very greatness they claim to pursue. Consider the perfectionist entrepreneur who believes their business plan must address every possible contingency before they can launch, or the artist who insists their technique must be flawless before they can create meaningful work, or the writer who demands their first draft be worthy of publication. These standards appear to be about quality, but Jung would see them as sophisticated avoidance mechanisms designed to prevent contact with one's own creative power. The impossible standards serve multiple psychological functions. First, they provide what Jung called noble procrastination, delay that feels virtuous rather than shameful. The perfectionist can spend years refining and preparing while feeling productive and dedicated. This maintains self-esteem while avoiding the vulnerability of actual creation and expression. Second, these standards create what Jung observed as perfectionist inflation, the fantasy that when the work is finally ready, it will be so extraordinary that all the waiting will have been worthwhile. This inflation serves to justify the endless delay while maintaining the illusion that something magnificent is being prepared. The individual can live in the comfortable space between current reality and imagined future perfection. The impossible standards also function as what Jung would call transcendence prophylactics, barriers that prevent breakthrough moments where the individual might discover their true capacity. By ensuring that conditions are never quite right for full expression, the perfectionist avoids the terrifying moment of actually testing their potential against reality. Jung observed that these standards often escalate over time. As the individual's skills and capabilities grow through preparation, the standards rise correspondingly, ensuring that readiness remains forever elusive. The goalposts move continuously, maintaining the gap between current ability and required perfection. This creates what he might call perpetual inadequacy syndrome, the chronic feeling of not being quite ready despite continuous improvement. The prison of impossible standards also manifests in what Jung called comparative perfectionism. The individual does not just need to create good work. They need to create work that surpasses all existing examples in their field. They must write better than the masters, create more beautifully than the greatest artists, or lead more effectively than history's greatest leaders. These comparative standards make action feel futile before it even begins. There is also the phenomenon of omni-perfectionism, the belief that all aspects of their work, life, or presentation must be simultaneously perfect before they can move forward. The perfectionist cannot launch their business until their website, product, marketing, finances, and personal appearance are all flawless. This creates an impossible coordination problem that virtually guarantees paralysis. Jung recognized that impossible standards often mask what he called outcome attachment, the unconscious belief that the perfectionist's worth and identity depend entirely on external validation of their work. Since this validation can never be guaranteed, the standards become impossibly high as a way of managing the anxiety around potential rejection or criticism. The most insidious aspect of these impossible standards is that they appear to be about excellence when they are actually about control. By maintaining impossibly high requirements for action, the perfectionist maintains complete control over their exposure to risk, vulnerability, and potential failure. They can remain safely contained within their current identity while appearing to pursue growth. Jung also observed that impossible standards often reflect what he called archetypal inflation, the unconscious attempt to meet not human standards but divine ones. The perfectionist does not want to create good human work. They want to create perfect, transcendent work that approaches the divine. Since humans cannot create divine perfection, this standard ensures permanent paralysis. The tragedy is that while the perfectionist waits for impossible conditions to be met, opportunities for meaningful contribution pass by. The world continues to need imperfect but valuable contributions, while the perfectionist remains locked in their beautiful prison of preparation. But what toll does this imprisonment take on the individual? What are the psychological costs of living in this state of perpetual preparation and deferred greatness? The cost of deferred greatness. Living in the prison of impossible standards exacts a psychological toll that extends far beyond simply not completing projects or reaching goals. For Carl Gustav Jung, the systematic avoidance of one's own greatness creates what he termed existential starvation, a form of spiritual malnutrition that occurs when the soul is chronically denied the expression it requires for health and vitality. One of the most devastating costs is what Jung called potential depression, a unique form of melancholy that arises not from loss or trauma, but from the chronic awareness of unlived possibilities. The perfectionist carries within them a constant gnawing sense of what could be, what should be, what might have been if only conditions were right. This creates a perpetual state of mourning for the unexpressed self, a grief for gifts that remain unshared and impacts that remain unmade. The individual trapped in perfectionist patterns often experiences what Jung observed as creative constipation, the buildup of unexpressed ideas, visions, and inspirations that have nowhere to go. This accumulated creative pressure often manifests as anxiety, restlessness, and a sense of internal pressure that cannot be released through normal activities. The soul demands expression, and when expression is chronically denied, psychological symptoms emerge. There is also the progressive erosion of what Jung called self-trust. Each day that passes without action, despite intentions and preparations, weakens the individual's confidence in their own ability to follow through on their deepest commitments. The perfectionist begins to experience themselves as fundamentally unreliable, unable to bridge the gap between vision and reality. This creates a vicious cycle. The less they trust themselves to act imperfectly, the higher their standards become. The higher their standards, the less likely they are to act at all. Jung recognized that deferred greatness often leads to what he termed compensatory grandiosity in fantasy life. Since the individual cannot allow themselves to be ordinarily great in reality, they escape into elaborate fantasies of extraordinary achievement. They may spend hours imagining the perfect reception of their perfect work, the accolades they will receive when they finally share their gifts with the world. This fantasy life becomes increasingly vivid and compelling, making actual imperfect action feel even more disappointing by comparison. The social costs are equally significant. Perfectionist individuals often become isolated not because others reject them, but because they reject others who do not share their impossible standards. They may become critical of those who produce merely good work, unconsciously resenting others who have the courage to be imperfect in public. This creates a lonely existence where the perfectionist feels simultaneously superior to and envious of those who actually create and contribute. There is also what Jung observed as temporal displacement anxiety, the growing awareness that time is passing while potential remains unrealized. As months and years accumulate in preparation mode, the perfectionist begins to feel a desperate urgency that paradoxically makes action feel even more overwhelming. The weight of accumulated time creates pressure that makes the stakes feel impossibly high for any single action. Jung understood that unexpressed greatness often manifests somatically. The body becomes the repository for all the unreleased creative energy, leading to tension, fatigue, and various physical symptoms that have no clear medical cause. The life force that should be flowing outward through creative expression becomes trapped within the body, creating what he called embodied frustration. Perhaps most tragically, the perfectionist often develops what Jung termed excellence aversion, an unconscious association between their greatest gifts and psychological pain. Since accessing their potential has become connected with anxiety, paralysis, and self-criticism, they may begin to avoid the very activities and pursuits that could fulfill them. They become allergic to their own greatness, finding elaborate ways to stay busy with lesser pursuits that don't trigger their perfectionist patterns. The cost extends beyond the individual to the world itself. Jung believed that each person carries unique gifts that the world needs, and when those gifts remain unexpressed due to perfectionist paralysis, everyone suffers the loss. The book that could have inspired someone remains unwritten. The business that could have created value remains unlaunched. The art that could have brought beauty remains uncreated. Perfectionism creates not just personal tragedy, but collective impoverishment. There is also the accumulating weight of what Jung called existential debt, the growing awareness of the gap between who one could be and who one is actually being. This debt compounds over time, making each day of inaction feel more significant and each potential action feel more loaded with meaning. The longer the perfectionist waits, the more perfect their eventual offering feels it must be to justify the delay. But Jung was never merely a diagnostician of psychological suffering. His ultimate interest was always in healing and transformation. The question becomes, how does one break free from this cycle? How does one move from the prison of impossible standards into authentic, imperfect greatness? The path of imperfect courage. Carl Gustav Jung's approach to healing perfectionist paralysis was radically different from conventional self-help strategies focused on goal setting or time management. Jung understood that lasting transformation required what he called conscious suffering, the willingness to feel the terror of imperfection in service of authentic expression. The path to greatness, he recognized, leads through the valley of deliberate imperfection. The first step in this journey is what Jung termed standard deflation, the conscious lowering of impossible criteria to merely human levels. This is not about accepting mediocrity, but about recognizing that excellence emerges through iteration, not through initial perfection. The perfectionist must learn to distinguish between standards that serve excellence and standards that prevent it. Jung believed that this deflation process requires what he called archetypal humility, the recognition that we are human beings attempting to express something greater through imperfect vessels, not gods trying to create perfect works. This humility paradoxically opens the door to greater achievement by removing the psychological barriers that perfectionism creates. The path forward involves learning to practice what Jung would call sacred imperfection, the conscious choice to create and share work that is not yet perfect, but carries authentic value. This requires developing what he saw as courage of vulnerability, the willingness to be seen in our human limitations while still offering our gifts to the world. Jung understood that perfectionist patterns cannot be overcome through force or willpower. Instead, they must be approached with what he called loving consciousness, the ability to observe our patterns with compassion while gradually choosing different responses. This means noticing when perfectionist anxiety arises and responding with curiosity rather than criticism. What is this fear trying to protect? What would it mean to proceed anyway? Another crucial element is developing what Jung called process attachment, rather than outcome attachment. Instead of being attached to creating perfect results, the individual learns to find meaning and satisfaction in the process of creation itself. This shift in focus removes much of the performance anxiety that fuels perfectionist paralysis. Jung also recognized the importance of what he termed imperfect action as spiritual practice. Each time we choose to act despite our work not meeting impossible standards, we engage in a form of spiritual discipline. We practice trusting in something larger than our ego's need for control and validation. We learn to serve the work itself rather than our image of ourselves as perfect creators. The transformation process often involves what Jung called perfectionist detox, deliberately engaging in activities where excellence is impossible or irrelevant. This might mean taking up a completely new skill where beginner status is inevitable, or setting artificial time constraints that make perfection impossible. These experiences help rewire the nervous system's association between action and performance anxiety. Jung believed that authentic greatness emerges when we learn to channel what he called archetypal energy through our imperfect human vessels. This means recognizing that our gifts are not personal possessions to be perfected, but universal energies seeking expression through us. Our job is not to be perfect channels, but to be willing channels. The path also involves developing what Jung termed creative faith, trust in the creative process itself rather than in our ability to control outcomes. This faith allows us to begin projects without knowing how they will end, to share work without knowing how it will be received, to express ourselves without guaranteeing the results will meet our standards. Jung observed that breakthrough often occurs when the individual finally becomes more committed to serving their gifts than to protecting their image. This shift from self-focus to service focus naturally dissolves much of the anxiety that feeds perfectionist patterns. When we focus on what we can give rather than how we might be judged, action becomes more natural and less fraught. The integration process also involves what Jung called failure reframing, learning to see mistakes, criticism, and imperfect results not as evidence of inadequacy, but as information for improvement. This requires developing what he saw as meta-perspective, the ability to see our current efforts as part of a larger developmental process, rather than final judgments on our worth. Jung understood that this transformation is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice. Each time we choose imperfect action over perfect paralysis, we strengthen what he called courage muscles and weaken the neural pathways that maintain perfectionist patterns. But how do we implement these insights practically? How do we translate Jung's profound psychological understanding into daily actions that can break the cycle of perfectionist paralysis. Practical integration. While Jung's insights into perfectionist psychology are transformative, they must be translated into concrete practices that can be applied in daily life. The journey from paralysis to authentic action requires specific strategies that honor both the psychological depth Jung revealed and the practical need for measurable change. The first practical application of Jung's understanding is what we might call imperfection scheduling, deliberately building imperfection into your creative process. Set artificial constraints that make perfection impossible. Write for only 20 minutes, create with limited resources, or impose tight deadlines that prevent extensive revision. These constraints force you to work with what Jung called good enough excellence and help rewire your relationship with imperfection. Jung's concept of conscious suffering can be applied through discomfort tolerance training. When perfectionist anxiety arises, instead of avoiding the discomfort by returning to preparation mode, practice sitting with the feeling for 5 minutes while continuing to work. Notice the sensations in your body, the thoughts in your mind, but don't let them stop your progress. This builds psychological muscle for tolerating the inevitable discomfort of imperfect creation. The practice of standard deflation can be implemented through what Jung might call minimum viable excellence. Before beginning any project, define the absolute minimum standard that would still provide value to others. This becomes your initial target, not your final destination, but your first milestone. Once you reach this minimum viable excellence, you can choose to iterate and improve, but you've broken the paralysis barrier. Jung's understanding of archetypal energy suggests another powerful practice: channeling versus controlling. Before starting creative work, spend a few minutes connecting with the larger purpose or energy you're serving. Ask yourself, what wants to be expressed through me? This shifts focus from personal performance to serving something greater, which naturally reduces perfectionist anxiety. The concept of process attachment can be developed through daily process journaling. At the end of each work session, write about what you discovered, what you learned, or what surprised you during the process, regardless of the quality of the output. This trains your attention to find satisfaction in the journey rather than only in perfect destinations. Jung's insight about creative faith can be practiced through what he might call trust exercises. Begin projects without complete plans, share work before it feels ready, or commit to deadlines before you know exactly how you'll meet them. Each act of faith strengthens your ability to act despite uncertainty and imperfection. Another practical application involves perfectionist pattern interruption. When you notice yourself entering preparation loops, researching endlessly, revising unnecessarily, or setting up elaborate systems, set a timer for 15 minutes and force yourself to create something crude and imperfect within that time frame. This breaks the psychological momentum of avoidance. Jung's understanding of shadow work suggests the practice of excellence archaeology, exploring your personal history with perfectionism. Write about when you first learned to associate your worth with perfect performance. What messages did you receive about mistakes? Who modeled perfectionist patterns for you? Understanding the origins of your patterns reduces their unconscious power. The concept of archetypal humility can be cultivated through beginner's mind practice. Regularly engage in activities where you're genuinely a beginner. Take classes, learn new skills, or attempt unfamiliar challenges. This maintains psychological flexibility and prevents perfectionist patterns from calcifying around your areas of competence. Jung's insight about service over self can be implemented through contribution focus. Before beginning any creative work, write down 3 ways this imperfect effort could benefit others. Focus on potential contribution rather than personal validation. This external focus naturally reduces the internal pressure that feeds perfectionism. Another powerful practice is iterative excellence, committing to creating multiple versions rather than one perfect version. Plan to write 3 drafts, create 5 prototypes, or produce 10 variations. This removes pressure from any single attempt while maintaining high overall standards through repetition and refinement. The practice of conscious completion addresses the perfectionist's difficulty with finishing. Set specific completion criteria in advance, and when those criteria are met, consciously choose to finish regardless of remaining imperfections. Create completion rituals that honor the work while acknowledging its imperfect nature. Jung's understanding of the transcendent function suggests both and integration exercises. Practice holding paradox. This work is both imperfect and valuable. I am both afraid and capable. This project is both unfinished and complete enough. This reduces the psychological pressure to resolve all contradictions before taking action. Finally, implement what Jung would recognize as courage compound interest. Each small act of imperfect courage makes the next one easier. Start with very small expressions of imperfect greatness and gradually increase the stakes as your tolerance for imperfection grows. Remember, the goal is not to eliminate your high standards, but to serve them more effectively. True excellence emerges through iteration, feedback, and refinement, all of which require the courage to be imperfect in public. Jung's ultimate message about perfectionism is paradoxical. We become most excellent when we release our attachment to perfection. We touch greatness not by avoiding all mistakes, but by making mistakes in service of something meaningful. The path to authentic greatness leads through the valley of conscious imperfection. The question is not whether you are ready to be perfect, but whether you're ready to be courageously human in service of your gifts. Your greatness is not waiting for your perfection. Your greatness is waiting for your courage. If this exploration resonates with you, share in the comments what project or expression you've been perfecting instead of completing. Sometimes naming our patterns in community is the first step toward transformation. What imperfect greatness is calling for your courage today? The world needs your gifts more than it needs your perfection. Will you finally answer the call?